In life, there are stories that touch our hearts and demand our attention. Tales that show us the power of resilience, compassion, and the fight for justice. Today, we bring you the story of Frida Waltra, a 73-year-old Black woman whose unwavering dedication and hard work were tested by a toxic corporate culture that thrived on prejudice. Frida gave 50 years of her life to Primetech Industries, only to face humiliation, invisibility, and heartbreak. Yet, when everything seemed lost, a single act of courage began to rewrite the narrative. This is more than just a story about workplace discrimination. It's a lesson in empathy, love, and the incredible strength it takes to confront injustice. Together, we'll explore how a culture of indifference can break even the most resilient, and how one person's bravery can light the way for others. If you believe in standing up for what's right and want to support stories that inspire change, subscribe to our channel and join our community. Let's hear your thoughts in the comments below. I believe in the courage to create a world where love and justice prevail. Together, we can create a ripple effect of positivity and hope. For half a century, Frida Waltra gave her heart and soul to Primetech Industries. From the tender age of 23, she dedicated herself to maintaining the cleanliness and order of the company's offices. Her work ethic was unmatched. Through sickness, personal struggles, and the relentless march of time, Frida remained a pillar of reliability. Yet, as the years went by, her contribution seemed to fade into the background, her presence becoming little more than an afterthought. At first, Frida didn't notice the subtle ways she was being overlooked. After all, her upbringing had instilled in her a deep sense of humility and a belief that hard work would always be recognized in the end. She took pride in her job, knowing that her efforts created a safe and welcoming space for others. But as she approached her 50th year at Primetech, Frida couldn't ignore the glaring truth any longer. To most of her colleagues, she was invisible. Invisibility crept into Frida's life like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't just that people stopped greeting her in the hallways or avoided eye contact. It was in the way they left their messes without a second thought, as if assuming some faceless entity would handle it. It was in the silence that followed her polite "good morning" and the way conversations shifted when she entered a room. To Frida, these moments weren't just acts of rudeness. They were reminders of her isolation. The workplace, once a source of pride and belonging, became a place of quiet alienation. Still, Frida pressed on. Every task she completed was an act of quiet defiance, a reminder to herself that her work mattered, even if no one else seemed to notice. Then there was Nicolaus Bryan. As Frida's direct supervisor, Nicolaus wielded power like a blunt instrument, using it to diminish rather than uplift. He was the embodiment of everything wrong with Primetech's culture: dismissive, arrogant, and utterly devoid of empathy. To Nicolaus, Frida wasn't an employee with decades of dedication. She was a relic, a symbol of a bygone era he was eager to erase. His disdain wasn't always overt, but it was palpable in the way he addressed her. He would speak to her as if she were a child, his tone dripping with condescension. In meetings, he referred to her as the cleaning lady in a way that suggested her work was beneath everyone else's notice. His jokes, though veiled, were sharp enough to wound. And when Frida made a mistake a rare occurrence, Nicolaus made sure everyone knew about it. Frida's interactions with Nicolaus became a daily reminder of how little she was valued. Yet she held her head high, refusing to let his disdain break her spirit. But the culture Nicolaus embodied extended far beyond his office. At Primetech, youth and flashiness were prized above experience and loyalty. Employees like Frida, who worked in the background to keep the company running smoothly, were seen as expendable. It wasn't just racism or ageism, it was a pervasive indifference that dehumanized anyone who didn't fit the mold of what Primetech deemed worthy. Frida's invisibility wasn't confined to her workplace. It seeped into her personal life too. Friends and family, though supportive, often failed to grasp the depth of her struggles. They saw her resilience as a shield, not realizing how much it cost her to maintain that facade. Frida often found herself wondering if her sacrifices had been worth it. She had given so much to Primetech: her time, her energy, her health. But what had she gained in return? The answer, more often than not, left her heart heavy. Amidst this sea of indifference, there were small glimmers of hope. A few co-workers recognized Frida's worth and treated her with the respect she deserved. One such individual was Christopher Willis, an accountant who had worked at PrimeTech for nearly a decade. Christopher was quiet and unassuming, but he saw things others didn't. He noticed the way Nikolaus treated Frida, the way she was excluded from office events, and the way her contributions were overlooked. He felt a deep sense of injustice but struggled with the fear of speaking up. Christopher's silence wasn't born of apathy. It was rooted in a fear that had been ingrained in him since childhood. He knew what it was like to feel powerless, and he feared that challenging the status quo would cost him his job. For Frida, Christopher's small acts of kindness, a warm smile, a sincere thank you, meant more than he could have imagined. They were reminders that her humanity hadn't been entirely erased. But Christopher's kindness wasn't enough to counterbalance the weight of PrimeTech's toxic culture. Frida continued to endure the daily indignities of her role, each one chipping away at her sense of self-worth. And as the years went by, she found it increasingly difficult to hold on to the hope that things would get better. Frida's story is a testament to the quiet strength it takes to endure in the face of systemic indifference. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat those who work in the shadows, whose contributions are essential but often go unnoticed. How many Fredas are there in our world? How often do we fail to see them, to acknowledge their worth? And what can we do to ensure that their voices are heard? As we move forward, we'll delve deeper into the toxic culture of PrimeTech Industries, exploring how a system built on indifference and prejudice allowed someone like Nikolaus to thrive while someone like Frida was pushed further into the margins. What happens when that system is challenged? And who will have the courage to speak up? PrimeTech Industries wasn't always a toxic place to work. Decades earlier, when Frida Waltra first joined the company, it was a smaller operation with a more personal touch. Back then, employees knew each other by name, and the company felt like a community. Frida could still recall the early days when her work was acknowledged with genuine gratitude. When supervisors like Mr. Louis Prime, the company's founder, treated every worker with respect, regardless of their position. But those days were long gone. Over the years, as PrimeTech grew into a corporate giant, its culture shifted. The focus turned away from people and relationships, gravitating instead toward numbers, profits, and superficial appearances. By the time Nikolaus Bryan took on his managerial role, the company's values had eroded almost entirely. Employees were no longer seen as individuals with unique talents and histories. They were metrics, interchangeable and expendable. The culture prioritized youth, charm, and ambition. Workers who were older, quieter, or less flashy were left to fade into the background. Frida, with her decades of loyal service and humble demeanor, became an easy target for this systemic disregard. At the heart of PrimeTech's toxicity was a relentless pursuit of image over substance. Under the leadership of executives like Nikolaus, the company began to reward behaviors that aligned with this shallow ideal. Promotions often went to the most charismatic employees rather than the most capable. Those who could talk a good game, regardless of their actual contributions, were celebrated. Meanwhile, the quieter individuals who worked tirelessly to keep the company running were sidelined, their efforts dismissed as routine or unimportant. Frida's work, though essential to the company's day-to-day operations, was treated as an afterthought, something that just happened without anyone needing to acknowledge it. Nikolaus thrived in this environment. His leadership style was rooted in manipulation and fear. He knew how to charm those above him while keeping those below him in line through intimidation. His disdain for Frida wasn't just a personal prejudice. It was a reflection of the larger culture that valued surface-level achievements over genuine effort. To Nikolaus, Frida was an anomaly, a reminder of an era he wanted to erase. Her presence challenged his carefully curated image of modernity and progress. And so, he did everything in his power to diminish her. Nikolaus's actions were subtle enough to avoid scrutiny, but deliberate enough to inflict harm. He rarely addressed Frida directly. preferring to communicate through terse notes or secondhand messages. When he did speak to her, it was with a tone that made it clear he considered her beneath him. He often forgot to include her in staff emails or announcements, leaving her out of the loop on important changes that affected her work. On more than one occasion, he openly mocked her age, making snide comments about how she was stuck in the past or too slow to keep up. Nikolaus wasn't the only problem. His behavior set the tone for others in the company, creating an environment where cruelty and indifference were normalized. Younger employees, eager to align themselves with the culture of ambition and modernity, mimicked his dismissiveness toward Frida. They left their trash behind without a second thought, ignored her greetings, and avoided eye contact, as if acknowledging her presence would somehow diminish their own status. Some even laughed along when Nikolaus made his cutting remarks, eager to earn his approval. Frida was no stranger to hard work or adversity, but the daily onslaught of disrespect began to wear on her. She found herself questioning her worth, wondering if the decades she had poured into Primetech had been for nothing. She thought of her younger self, brimming with hope and determination, and felt a pang of sorrow. Where had that optimism gone? Had it been stripped away piece by piece over the years, stolen by the very company she had given so much to? Yet, Frida refused to let the culture break her completely. Every day, she showed up with the same quiet dignity that had defined her career. She performed her duties with care and precision, not because anyone demanded it, but because it was who she was. Her work was a reflection of her values: integrity, dedication, and a belief in the importance of doing what's right, even when no one is watching. But toxic cultures don't just affect individuals, they infect entire organizations. Primetech's indifference toward Frida and employees like her wasn't just a moral failing, it was a business liability. Over time, the company's prioritization of style over substance began to erode its foundation. Projects were delayed because flashy but inexperienced employees lacked the skills to deliver on their promises. Turnover rates skyrocketed as workers who felt undervalued sought opportunities elsewhere. Customer complaints increased, and Primetech's reputation began to suffer. But the leadership, blinded by its own arrogance, refused to see the connection between its culture and its declining performance. Christopher Willis, the young accountant who had befriended Frida, saw the cracks forming in the company's facade. He had always been uncomfortable with the way Frida was treated, but his position at Primetech felt precarious. As a junior employee, Christopher was acutely aware of the unspoken rules of survival in the company. Speaking out against someone like Nikolaus could cost him everything: his job, his reputation, his financial stability. And yet, every time he saw Nikolaus belittle Frida or witnessed her being excluded, the knot of guilt in his stomach grew tighter. Christopher wasn't the only one struggling with these feelings. Many of Frida's co-workers recognized the injustice of her situation, but felt powerless to intervene. The culture of fear and complacency that Nikolaus had cultivated silenced even those who wanted to do the right thing. It was easier to look the other way, to convince themselves that it wasn't their problem. But the weight of their silence was heavy, and it only grew heavier as time went on. As Frida continued to endure the toxic environment at Primetech, the toll on her well-being became increasingly apparent. She began to experience stress-related health issues, headaches, fatigue, and a persistent sense of anxiety that she couldn't shake. Her once bright eyes grew dim, and her cheerful demeanor gave way to a quiet resignation. Even her family noticed the change, urging her to consider retirement. But Frida, ever the fighter, refused to give up. She had dedicated 50 years of her life to Primetech, and she wasn't going to let people like Nikolaus push her out. Frida's perseverance was both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability. While it allowed her to endure the daily indignities she faced, it also made it easier for others to ignore her suffering. After all, she never complained or demanded recognition. She simply did her job and went home, carrying the weight of her struggles alone. But the weight was becoming too much to bear, and Frida was reaching her breaking point. What happens when a toxic culture is left unchecked? How long can an individual endure in the face of systemic injustice? And what will it take to challenge the status quo? In the next chapter, we'll witness the moment when Frida's resilience reaches its limit and the consequences that follow. Stay with us as we continue this powerful story of courage, compassion, and the fight for justice. Christopher Willis was not a man who sought conflict. In his late 20s, Christopher had joined PrimeTech Industries as an accountant, excited by the promise of stability and growth. His aspirations were modest. He didn't dream of corner offices or executive titles. All he wanted was to do good work, provide for his family, and maintain the sense of security that his modest upbringing had instilled in him. But life at PrimeTech proved far more complicated than he anticipated. From his first day, Christopher noticed the invisible hierarchies that dictated every interaction at the company. It wasn't just about job titles or salaries. There were unspoken rules: who mattered, who didn't, and who could be ignored without consequence. And from the very beginning, Frida Walter was firmly placed in the category of unseen. At first, Christopher didn't think much of it. Like many others, he was caught up in the whirlwind of his own responsibilities. But as he settled into his role, he began to see the patterns. He noticed how Nikolaus Bryan dismissed Frida's efforts with a wave of his hand or a sharp word. He saw how younger employees barely acknowledged her presence, treating her like part of the furniture rather than a colleague. And most troubling of all, he felt the weight of his own silence. Christopher liked Frida. In her, he saw a quiet dignity and a tireless work ethic that reminded him of his grandmother, a woman who had spent her life cleaning houses to give her family a better future. Frida wasn't just a janitor, she was a person with a history, with stories, with value. But at PrimeTech, that value went unrecognized, buried beneath layers of systemic prejudice and cultural indifference. The dilemma Christopher faced was one of conscience versus consequence. On one hand, he felt an undeniable pull to defend Frida, to speak out against the mistreatment he witnessed daily. On the other hand, he understood the risks. Nikolaus Bryan was not the kind of man who tolerated dissent. Employees who crossed him often found themselves sidelined, their careers stalling in ways that were impossible to ignore. And PrimeTech's HR department, under Nikolaus's influence, was known more for protecting the company's image than for addressing genuine grievances. Christopher found himself wrestling with a persistent question. What good is knowing what's right if you're too afraid to act on it? The answer didn't come easily. Each day, Christopher saw Frida endure casual slights and outright disrespect. He watched as Nikolaus barked orders at her, made cutting remarks about her age, and treated her like a burden rather than a valued team member. And each time, Christopher said nothing. He told himself it wasn't his place, that he wasn't in a position to make a difference. But deep down, he knew these were excuses, thin shields against the guilt that gnawed at him. Christopher's internal conflict came to a head during a team meeting. It was a routine gathering, meant to review upcoming projects and address logistical concerns. Frida, as usual, sat quietly in the corner, her notebook in hand, ready to take down any instructions. Midway through the meeting, Nikolaus made a disparaging comment about the state of the office, sarcastically wondering aloud if the cleaning staff had taken the week off. The room erupted in laughter, but Frida didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on her notebook, her pen motionless. Christopher looked around the room, hoping someone would say something, that someone would acknowledge the cruelty in Nikolaus's words. But no one did. The laughter died down, and the meeting continued as if nothing had happened. Christopher felt his stomach churn. He wanted to speak, to call out the injustice, but the words caught in his throat. The fear was too great, and the silence, once again, too easy. That night, Christopher couldn't sleep. The memory of Frida sitting in that room, enduring the humiliation with quiet grace, replayed in his mind over and over again. He thought of his grandmother, of the sacrifices she had made for her family, and wondered how she would feel if someone had treated her the way Frida was treated. The thought was unbearable. As days turned into weeks, Christopher's guilt began to weigh on him. He started avoiding the lunchroom, where Nikolaus and his inner circle often held court, their conversations laced with arrogance and condescension. He found excuses to stay late, hoping to avoid the awkward moments when Frida would pass him in the hall, her expression betraying none of the hurt he knew she carried. But avoidance wasn't a solution. It was a band-aid on a wound that wouldn't heal. The turning point came on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Christopher was working late, his desk illuminated by the soft glow of his computer screen. The office was nearly empty, save for Frida, who was cleaning the break room nearby. Christopher could hear the faint sound of her humming, a melody that spoke of resilience and hope. He felt a pang of admiration and shame. Without fully understanding why, Christopher got up and walked to the break room. Frida looked up, surprised but not unkind. Christopher hesitated, unsure of what to say. Finally, he blurted out, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you do. I don't think people say it enough." Frida smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression that lit up her face. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means a lot." The exchange was brief, but it planted a seed in Christopher's mind. For the first time, he realized that even small acts of kindness could make a difference. He couldn't change the culture of PrimeTech overnight, but he could start by acknowledging Frida's humanity, by letting her know that she wasn't invisible to everyone. Still, the dilemma of silence lingered. Christopher knew that true change required more than kind words, it required action. But action was risky, and Christopher wasn't sure he was brave enough to take that risk. He continued to grapple with his fears, his conscience waging a battle against the forces of self-preservation. What Christopher didn't realize was that his journey toward courage had already begun. Each step he took, each moment of reflection, was bringing him closer to the point where he would no longer be able to stand idly by. And when that moment came, when the weight of his silence became too much to bear, Christopher would discover the true meaning of bravery. As we continue this story, we'll witness the moment when Frida's struggles reach a heartbreaking climax, forcing Christopher and others to confront the consequences of their inaction. Stay with us as we explore the power of resilience, the cost of silence, and the extraordinary courage it takes to speak up in the face of injustice. Frida Waltra was a woman of immense strength. For 50 years, she had faced challenges with grace and fortitude, enduring the silent burden of being overlooked and undervalued at PrimeTech Industries. But even the strongest among us have limits, and Frida's resilience was no exception. The toxic culture, relentless disrespect, and constant stress had been chipping away at her well-being for years. Eventually, her body, no longer able to bear the weight of her struggles, gave out. The day began like any other. Frida arrived at the office before dawn, her uniform pressed and her mind focused on the tasks ahead. Despite her years of service, her workload had only increased over time, as budget cuts meant fewer janitorial staff and more responsibilities falling squarely on her shoulders. Yet, Frida carried on without complaint. She prided herself on her ability to handle whatever was thrown her way. But that morning, something felt different. Frida was unusually tired, a deep fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. Her chest felt tight, and her breaths came slower than usual. Still, she brushed it off, attributing it to the cold weather or perhaps just a restless night. She told herself she would push through, as she always had. The day unfolded predictably, with Frida moving between floors, cleaning offices, and ensuring that PrimeTech's employees had a spotless environment in which to work. Nicolaus Bryan, as was his custom, made a snide comment about her pace, muttering something about how the elderly should consider retirement before they become a liability. Frida ignored him, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the handle of her cleaning cart. She was used to his insults by now. But what she wasn't used to was the gnawing pain spreading across her chest and into her arms. As the hours passed, Frida's condition worsened. By midday, her vision had become blurry, and she struggled to steady herself as she moved through the hallways. Still, she refused to stop. She had always prided herself on her reliability, and she wasn't about to let anyone accuse her of slacking off. The breaking point came in the early afternoon. Frida was in the main conference room, scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain from the carpet, when a sharp, searing pain shot through her chest. Her hands instinctively clutched at her heart as her knees buckled beneath her. The room spun around her, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. It was several minutes before anyone noticed. When an employee finally entered the room and saw Frida lying there, they hesitated, unsure of what to do. Word spread quickly, and soon a small crowd gathered at the door, murmuring in hushed tones, but no one stepped forward to help. The fear of Nicholas's wrath loomed over them, paralyzing their compassion. It wasn't until Christopher Willis arrived on the scene that action was finally taken. Christopher's heart sank when he saw Frida on the floor, her face pale and her breathing labored. Without hesitation, he pushed through the crowd and knelt beside her. "Frida, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice trembling with urgency. She opened her eyes slightly, her gaze filled with pain and exhaustion. "I'm so sorry," she whispered weakly, as though apologizing for being an inconvenience. Christopher's chest tightened with guilt. How had it come to this? How had a woman who had given so much to this company been reduced to apologizing for her own suffering? Determined to help, Christopher called for an ambulance, his voice firm and resolute. He stayed by Frida's side, holding her hand and reassuring her as they waited for help to arrive. The crowd, still hovering by the door, began to disperse, their discomfort outweighing their curiosity. When the paramedics arrived, they quickly assessed Frida's condition and transported her to the hospital. As the stretcher was wheeled out of the building, Christopher felt a surge of anger and shame. How had everyone, including himself, allowed things to reach this point? Frida had been struggling for years, and no one had done anything to ease her burden. He couldn't shake the image of her frail body lying on the floor, a symbol of the company's failure to care for one of its own. But the most shocking reaction came from Nicolaus Bryan. When informed of Frida's collapse, he showed no concern. Instead, he saw the incident as an opportunity to assert his authority. "This is exactly why I've been saying we need younger, more capable staff," he remarked with a smug tone. "She should have retired years ago. Now look at the mess she's made." Christopher clenched his fists, his blood boiling at Nicholas's callousness. For years, he had remained silent, unwilling to risk his own position by speaking out. But now, something inside him shifted. Frida's collapse had made it painfully clear that silence was no longer an option. The cost of inaction was too high, and he couldn't bear to be complicit any longer. As Christopher sat at his desk later that evening, his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He knew that confronting Nicolaus directly would be risky. His reputation for retaliation was well known. But Christopher also knew that staying silent would only allow the toxic culture at PrimeTech to persist, putting others at risk of suffering the same fate as Frida. Meanwhile, news of Frida's collapse spread throughout the company, sparking conversations among employees who had long felt powerless to challenge the status quo. For some, it was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the human cost of their complacency. For others, it was a moment of reflection, prompting them to question the values and priorities of the company they worked for. As Frida lay in a hospital bed, recovering from the heart attack that had nearly claimed her life, she found herself grappling with a mix of emotions. She was grateful to be alive, but she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal. PrimeTech had been her life's work, and yet it had treated her as though she were disposable. She thought of Christopher, who had been the only one to step forward in her time of need, and felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps change was possible, but it would require courage that she hoped someone would find. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Frida's collapse becomes a catalyst for change within PrimeTech, forcing the company to confront its toxic culture and the systemic issues that allowed it to thrive. We'll also witness the growing resolve of Christopher, who begins to find his voice and take steps toward challenging the injustices he can no longer ignore. Stay with us as the story unfolds and the seeds of transformation are sown. Dennis Prime, the CEO of PrimeTech Industries, was a man who prided himself on the company his father had built from the ground up. The son of Louis Prime, Dennis inherited not only the company, but also the vision of integrity and fairness that had been the foundation of its early success. However, as PrimeTech expanded into a corporate powerhouse, Dennis had grown increasingly distant from its day-to-day operations. Entrusting much of the company's management to others, he assumed the values instilled by his father remained intact. Frida Waltra's collapse shattered that illusion. Dennis first heard about the incident through a routine weekly report. The details were sparse, A longtime employee had suffered a health crisis while on the job, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. As he read further, Dennis was alarmed by the dismissive language used to describe Frida and her decades of service. An aging janitor, the report read, experienced a medical emergency during her shift. No mention of her name, no mention of her contributions. Dennis's instincts told him this was more than just a health scare. It was a symptom of something deeper. Unlike many corporate leaders who might have let such an incident pass unnoticed, Dennis decided to investigate. He began by requesting detailed accounts from the Human Resources Department, departmental managers, and the medical team that had handled the case. What he found was troubling. Frida's collapse was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of neglect and mistreatment. The accounts painted a picture of a workplace culture that was toxic, dehumanizing, and riddled with systemic issues, particularly for employees who, like Frida, didn't fit the company's increasingly narrow image of valuable. Dennis was especially disturbed by the behavior of Nicolaus Bryan. Emails and reports revealed a pattern of discriminatory comments, dismissive actions, and outright hostility toward employees who didn't align with his vision of a modern workforce. Dennis couldn't ignore the fact that these behaviors were not only tolerated, but seemingly rewarded by the company's structure. He began to see how far PrimeTech had strayed from his father's vision. Determined to get to the bottom of the issue, Dennis called a private meeting with Frida. She was hesitant at first, unsure of what to expect from a man she had only seen in company newsletters and distant speeches. But Dennis's demeanor was warm, sincere, and disarming. He sat across from her, not as a CEO, but as someone eager to listen. "Frida," he began, his voice steady, "I've learned a lot about what happened to you, and I need to hear your side of the story. I want to understand." Frida, unused to such attention, took a moment to gather her thoughts. Slowly, she began to recount her experiences, the years of being overlooked, the snide remarks from Nicolaus, the way her contributions were minimized despite her dedication. She spoke of the loneliness she felt, the health issues that had begun to creep in, and the moment she realized she was no longer seen as a person, but as a function. Dennis listened intently, his expression growing more somber with every word. By the time Frida finished, he was both heartbroken and furious. "Frida, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You've given so much to this company, and we've failed you. I've failed you. That ends now." Dennis's next step was swift and decisive. He launched an internal investigation, bringing in an independent firm to assess the workplace culture at PrimeTech. The findings were damning. Surveys, interviews, and documents revealed a pervasive culture of discrimination, favoritism, and fear. Employees spoke of feeling silenced, undervalued, and pressured to conform to unrealistic expectations. Nicolaus Bryan was identified as a central figure in perpetuating this toxic environment, but the report also made it clear that the problem extended far beyond him. The culture was systemic, deeply ingrained in the company's policies, practices, and leadership. Faced with these revelations, Dennis knew that incremental changes would not be enough. He called an emergency meeting with his executive team, presenting the findings and outlining a plan for sweeping reform. "This is not who we are," Dennis declared, his voice firm. "This is not the company my father built, and it's not the company I intend to lead." The plan included mandatory training on diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as new policies designed to protect employees from discrimination and harassment. Dennis also committed to creating a task force, led by representatives from all levels of the company, to ensure these changes were implemented effectively and transparently. But Dennis knew that policy changes alone wouldn't be enough to heal the wounds of the past. He needed to set an example, and that meant addressing Nicolaus's behavior directly. Calling Nicolaus into his office, Dennis wasted no time. "Your actions have brought disgrace to this company," Dennis said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Nicolaus, accustomed to brushing off criticism, tried to defend himself, citing his results and claiming that his methods were misunderstood. But Dennis wasn't swayed. "Results mean nothing if they come at the cost of our values," he said firmly. "Your behavior has not only harmed Frida, but has damaged the trust and morale of our entire workforce. You're no longer a part of this company. Nicholas's termination sent shockwaves through PrimeTech. For years, he had been seen as untouchable, a symbol of the company's ruthless culture. His removal marked a turning point, signaling that no one was above accountability. As the reforms began to take effect, the atmosphere at PrimeTech started to shift. Employees who had once felt powerless began to find their voices. Conversations about respect, fairness, and inclusion became more common. Frida, though still recovering from her health scare, found herself at the center of these changes. Her courage in speaking out, combined with Dennis's commitment to listening and acting, had set the wheels of transformation in motion. But the road ahead was still long. Changing a culture as entrenched as PrimeTech's would take time, effort, and unwavering dedication. Dennis knew this, but he was determined. His father had built PrimeTech on the principles of integrity and respect, and Dennis was committed to restoring those values. As he walked through the halls of the company, now filled with renewed hope and energy, he thought of Frida and the countless others who had been overlooked for too long. They deserved better, and Dennis was resolved to deliver on that promise. In the next chapter, we'll see how the cultural changes at PrimeTech begin to inspire others, including Christopher Willis, who finds the courage to take a stand. His decision will have far-reaching consequences, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation and a powerful message about the importance of accountability and justice. Stay with us as this story of resilience, transformation, and courage continues to unfold. Change is never easy, and at PrimeTech Industries, it was met with resistance. For decades, the company had operated under a culture that rewarded silence, celebrated superficial success, and dismissed those who didn't fit its narrow mold of what it meant to be valuable. Undoing that culture was no small task, but Dennis Prime was committed to the journey. The toxic environment that had allowed people like Nicolaus Bryan to thrive was now under scrutiny, and every layer of the organization was about to feel the ripple effects of transformation. The first step was to address the immediate concerns raised by the internal investigation. Dennis implemented mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all employees, starting with senior management. These sessions were not mere checkboxes. They were designed to challenge biases, foster empathy, and encourage accountability. Employees were given a safe space to share their experiences and concerns, many of which had been bottled up for years. It was an emotional process, marked by difficult conversations and moments of raw vulnerability. One of the most significant policy changes was the introduction of a zero-tolerance stance on discrimination and harassment. A new reporting system was established, allowing employees to raise concerns anonymously without fear of retaliation. A dedicated ethics committee was formed, composed of representatives from various departments, to investigate claims and ensure transparency. Dennis also brought in external consultants to oversee the reforms, ensuring that the process was impartial and rooted in best practices. As these changes were rolled out, Frida Walter became a symbol of the company's renewed focus on dignity and respect. Dennis made it a point to publicly acknowledge her contributions, not as an act of pity, but as a recognition of her invaluable role in the company's history. A ceremony was held in her honor, where Frida was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Her name was added to a commemorative plaque in the company's main lobby, a permanent reminder of her dedication and resilience. The ceremony was a bittersweet moment for Frida. While she was grateful for the recognition, she couldn't ignore the years of hardship that had led to this point. But as she stood on the stage, looking out at her colleagues, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time: hope. For the first time in years, Frida felt seen, not just as an employee, but as a person. The changes at PrimeTech weren't just symbolic, they were structural. New hiring practices were introduced to ensure a more diverse and inclusive workforce. Performance evaluations were redesigned to value collaboration, integrity, and the impact of an employee's work, rather than their ability to self-promote. Leaders like Nicolaus, who thrived on manipulation and fear, were replaced with individuals who embodied the company's new values. These reforms began to foster a sense of trust and camaraderie among employees. Teams that had once operated in silos started collaborating more openly, sharing ideas and supporting one another. The atmosphere in the office began to shift from one of competition and suspicion to one of mutual respect and shared purpose. Even those who had initially resisted the changes found themselves reconsidering their perspectives as they witnessed the positive impact on morale and productivity. Christopher Willis, the young accountant who had long struggled with his own silence, was one of the many employees inspired by the cultural shift. For years, Christopher had been paralyzed by fear, unwilling to speak out against the injustices he witnessed. But as he watched Dennis Prime take a stand and saw the bravery of employees like Frida, something inside him began to change. Christopher started by making small gestures. He reached out to Frida, offering her words of encouragement and support during her recovery. He began participating more actively in the diversity training sessions, sharing his own observations about the toxic dynamics at PrimeTech. And most importantly, he began to find his voice. One day, Christopher made a decision that would change the trajectory of his career. He requested a meeting with the newly formed ethics committee to report his experiences with Nikolaos and the broader culture of discrimination he had witnessed. It wasn't an easy choice. Christopher knew there could be backlash, even with the new protections in place. But he also knew that staying silent was no longer an option. During the meeting, Christopher spoke candidly about the incidents he had observed, from Nikolaos's derogatory comments to the ways Frida and other employees were systematically marginalized. His testimony was both a reckoning and a call to action, urging the committee to ensure that no one else at PrimeTech would have to endure what Frida had endured. Christopher's courage had a ripple effect. Other employees, inspired by his example, began coming forward with their own stories. The flood of reports revealed just how deep the issues at PrimeTech ran, but it also highlighted the potential for change when people felt empowered to speak up. The ethics committee, bolstered by this newfound sense of purpose, took swift action to address the concerns, further solidifying the company's commitment to transformation. As the reforms took hold, Dennis Prime kept a close eye on the progress. He knew that real change would take time and that there would be setbacks along the way. But he was determined to stay the course, guided by the principles his father had instilled in him. "A company is only as strong as its people," Dennis often said, echoing the wisdom of his late father. "And it's our duty to ensure that every person here feels valued, respected, and heard." PrimeTech's journey toward cultural transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some employees resisted the changes, clinging to the old ways out of fear or stubbornness. Others questioned whether the company's new commitments were genuine or simply a public relations move. But as time went on, the results spoke for themselves. Employee satisfaction scores began to rise, turnover rates decreased, and PrimeTech's reputation started to recover. Clients and partners took notice, praising the company for its renewed focus on ethics and inclusivity. For Frida, the changes brought a sense of closure. She continued to work at PrimeTech, albeit on a reduced schedule to accommodate her recovery. Each day, she was greeted with smiles and genuine appreciation from her colleagues, a stark contrast to the indifference she had once faced. Frida knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but she took comfort in knowing that her story had sparked a movement, one that would benefit countless others in the years to come. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Christopher Willis's growing courage leads to a pivotal moment that changes the course of PrimeTech's history. His actions will serve as a powerful reminder of the impact one person can have when they choose to stand up for what's right. Stay with us as we delve deeper into this inspiring tale of resilience, justice, and the power of speaking up. Christopher Willis had always considered himself a quiet observer, someone who preferred to work in the background rather than stand in the spotlight. His years at PrimeTech Industries had reinforced this tendency, as the culture seemed to reward those who kept their heads down and avoided making waves. Yet, in the wake of Frida Waltra's collapse and the sweeping reforms initiated by Dennis Prime, Christopher found himself at a crossroads. The changes around him were encouraging, but they also brought a realization. Transformation required action, and action required courage. Christopher had spent countless nights replaying the events of that fateful day in his mind. He could still see Frida lying on the floor, her face pale and her breathing labored, while others stood by in silence. He remembered the smug indifference in Nicolaus Bryan's tone when he dismissed Frida as a liability. And, most of all, he remembered his own hesitation, the paralysis of fear that kept him from speaking up when it mattered most. But something inside Christopher had shifted. He could no longer ignore the gnawing guilt that came with his inaction, nor could he dismiss the spark of hope ignited by the changes at PrimeTech. The culture that once silenced voices like his was beginning to crumble, and Christopher knew it was time to step forward and add his own voice to the chorus, calling for justice. Christopher's first act of courage came in a meeting with his team. The diversity and inclusion training sessions had opened the door to conversations that were previously avoided, and Christopher saw an opportunity to address the lingering tension. As the meeting progressed, he took a deep breath and shared his thoughts. "I think we've all seen how Frida was treated, and I believe we have a responsibility to ensure that doesn't happen again. We need to be better, not just as individuals, but as a team." The room fell silent, and Christopher braced himself for pushback. But instead, he saw nods of agreement. A few colleagues spoke up, sharing their own frustrations with the old ways of PrimeTech and expressing their support for the changes Dennis Prime was implementing. For the first time, Christopher felt the power of solidarity. It was a small moment, but it reinforced his resolve to take further action. The turning point came during a company-wide town hall meeting. Dennis Prime had called the meeting to provide an update on the reforms and to invite employees to share their thoughts and experiences. As Dennis spoke, Christopher's heart raced. He had been debating whether to speak up, knowing the risks and rewards of doing so. But as he looked around the room and saw Frida sitting in the front row, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of why these changes mattered, he made his decision. When Dennis opened the floor for questions and comments, Christopher raised his hand. The room seemed to hold its breath as he stood and addressed the audience. "I want to talk about what happened to Frida," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I watched her dedicate herself to this company for decades, only to be treated as if she didn't matter. And I didn't say anything. I stayed silent because I was afraid of losing my job, afraid of standing out, afraid of being the next target." Christopher paused, gathering his thoughts. But Frida's collapse showed me that silence is its own kind of complicity. If we don't speak up, if we don't challenge the injustices we see, we allow them to continue. I want to thank Dennis for the steps he's taken to change our culture, but I also want to challenge all of us to do more. It's not enough to implement policies or attend training sessions. We have to live these values every day, in the way we treat each other, in the way we speak up when something is wrong. The room erupted in applause, a wave of support that took Christopher by surprise. As he sat down, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt free, not from fear, but from the silence that had held him captive for so long. Christopher's words had a profound impact. His colleagues began to see him in a new light, not just as a quiet accountant, but as a leader willing to stand up for what was right. His courage inspired others to share their own stories, creating a ripple effect that strengthened the company's commitment to change. The Ethics Committee, already bolstered by the reforms, received a flood of reports and suggestions from employees eager to contribute to the transformation. Frida, who had been listening intently to Christopher's speech, felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had always believed that courage could inspire others, but seeing it happen in real time was something else entirely. After the meeting, she approached Christopher, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said simply. "You don't know how much that meant to me." Christopher smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "You deserve it, Frida. And so does everyone else who's been overlooked. It's time we started building something better." As Christopher continued to find his voice, he became a key figure in PrimeTech's cultural transformation. He joined the Ethics Committee, using his position to advocate for transparency and accountability. He also became a mentor to newer employees, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to speak up when they saw something wrong. Christopher's journey wasn't without challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if the changes would stick. But each step forward reinforced his belief in the power of collective action. PrimeTech began to feel like a different company. Employees who had once kept their heads down now spoke openly about their ideas and concerns. The once toxic atmosphere was replaced with a sense of possibility and hope. And while there was still work to be done, the progress was undeniable. Christopher's courage was a testament to the idea that one person can make a difference. By choosing to speak up, he not only honored Frida's resilience, but also helped to pave the way for a brighter future at PrimeTech. His actions served as a reminder that bravery isn't about the absence of fear. It's about moving forward despite it. In the next chapter, we'll explore the consequences of these changes, both for Nicolaus Bryan and for PrimeTech as a whole. We'll see how the story of one individual's courage can inspire an entire organization to confront its flaws and embrace the values of justice, integrity, and compassion. Stay with us as this powerful tale of transformation reaches its conclusion. The winds of change swept through PrimeTech Industries, transforming it into a workplace that began to reflect the values it had long claimed to uphold. For Frida Waltra, Christopher Willis, and countless others who had suffered under the toxic culture, the changes brought both relief and a sense of vindication. But as the dust settled, the consequences of these transformations revealed both the lingering scars of the past and the hope of a brighter future. The first and most immediate consequence was the public dismissal of Nicolaus Bryan. His termination, announced company-wide in a transparent memo from Dennis Prime, was met with mixed reactions. For some, it was a long overdue reckoning. Employees who had borne the brunt of Nicholas's abusive management felt a sense of justice. For others, especially those who had aligned themselves with him, it was a sobering reminder that the old ways of operating were no longer tolerated. Nicolaus himself left in disgrace, though not without attempting to shift the blame. In a brief statement to a local business journal, he claimed he had been unfairly targeted and accused PrimeTech of succumbing to performative politics. His words fell flat, overshadowed by the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct and the growing chorus of voices that had come forward to expose the harm he had caused. Frida, though heartened by Nicholas's removal, understood that his departure was only one step in a larger journey. The toxic culture he had perpetuated was not solely his creation. It was the result of years of neglect, indifference, and misplaced priorities. Still, seeing him held accountable was a powerful moment, one that affirmed her belief in the importance of standing up against injustice. Christopher Willis emerged as an unlikely hero in the aftermath of these changes. His courage in speaking out had not only inspired his colleagues, but also earned him the respect of the company's leadership. Dennis Prime personally commended Christopher for his bravery, inviting him to join a new advisory group tasked with monitoring the company's progress toward its cultural goals. Christopher accepted the role with humility, recognizing that his journey of growth and accountability was far from over. The broader impact of PrimeTech's transformation extended beyond its walls. The company's efforts to rebuild its reputation caught the attention of the media, sparking conversations about workplace equity and the responsibilities of corporate leadership. Dennis Prime, once reluctant to step into the public eye, became a vocal advocate for systemic change, sharing PrimeTech's story as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. But for Frida, the most meaningful consequence of the changes at PrimeTech was the personal transformation she witnessed in her colleagues. Co-workers who had once ignored her began to greet her warmly, acknowledging her presence with genuine respect. Younger employees sought her advice, eager to learn from her years of experience. Even small acts of kindness, like a handwritten note of gratitude left on her cleaning cart, became symbols of the company's renewed commitment to human dignity. As Frida reflected on her journey, she felt a deep sense of pride. The path had not been easy, and the scars of her struggles would remain with her. But she also knew that her story had made a difference. By enduring, by speaking up, and by refusing to let herself be defined by the prejudice she faced. Frida had helped to spark a transformation that would benefit generations to come. Christopher, too, found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He thought often about the power of silence, the ways it could protect and the ways it could harm. In choosing to break his own silence, Christopher had discovered a strength he didn't know he possessed. And while the journey had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. As PrimeTech continued its transformation, the company became a case study in the challenges and rewards of cultural change. The reforms were not perfect, nor were they complete, but the willingness to confront difficult truths, to listen to those who had been silenced, and to take meaningful action had set PrimeTech on a path toward redemption. For Frida, Christopher, and the countless others who had played a role in this journey, the story of PrimeTech was a reminder of the extraordinary power of courage, compassion, and accountability. It was a story about the importance of seeing one another not as roles or titles, but as human beings with inherent value and dignity. As we conclude this powerful narrative, we invite you to reflect on its lessons. What role can you play in creating a world where justice, empathy, and courage prevail? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I believe in the power of courage to create a better future. Together, let's continue to inspire change, one story at a time. Stay tuned for our final message and an important call to action. Frida Walters' journey is more than just a story of endurance. It's a call to action. It challenges us to reflect on our own workplaces, communities, and lives. How often do we overlook the contributions of others? How often do we remain silent when we witness injustice, thinking that it's not our place or that our voice won't matter? Frida's resilience and Christopher Willis's courage remind us that change begins with individuals who are willing to take a stand. At PrimeTech Industries, a culture of indifference nearly destroyed the spirit of one of its most loyal employees. But through the power of accountability and action, the company found a way to rebuild itself. It wasn't an easy journey, nor was it perfect. True transformation never is. Yet, the courage to confront difficult truths and the commitment to doing better set PrimeTech on a path toward becoming a workplace where every person's dignity is valued. Frida's story inspires us to embrace empathy, to recognize the humanity in others, and to take a stand against systems and behaviors that perpetuate harm. Christopher's journey, meanwhile, serves as a powerful example of how one person's bravery can ignite a movement. His decision to break the silence didn't just change his life, it changed the lives of everyone around him. As we close this narrative, we leave you with a question. What will you do when faced with the opportunity to stand up for what's right? Will you remain silent, or will you find the courage to speak up? It's not always easy to challenge the status quo, but as Frida and Christopher have shown us, the rewards of doing so are immeasurable. If Frida's story has touched your heart and inspired you to take action, we encourage you to carry its lessons forward. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this, stories that inspire, challenge, and empower. Let's build a community where kindness, justice, and courage are celebrated. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start with this phrase: I choose courage and compassion to create a better world. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Together, we can amplify the voices of the unheard, stand against injustice, and create a world where everyone is seen, respected, and valued. Until next time, take care and stay inspired.